People in West Feliciana said the Delacroix house was cursed because two members of the family wasted away in the same upstairs room within 48 days. But the curse, if there was one, had hands. It knew where the porcelain cups were kept. It knew when the doctor was not looking. It knew which infant bottle belonged to the newest heir. And it belonged to the woman who had already brought half that bloodline into the world. What follows has been pieced together from parish death registers, court minutes, a physician's notebook, plantation inventories, and fragments of testimony preserved long after the people themselves were gone. Some details survived because the scandal was too large for Louisiana's river parishes to forget. Others survived because the household that tried to bury them kept writing things down. The summer of 1837 settled over Bellefont plantation like wet cloth. The estate sat several miles above St. Francisville, where the river bent hard and the cane fields spread in rigid rows toward the tree line. From the front gallery of the main house, you could see flatboats drifting south, and hear, on some evenings, the groan of wagon axles returning from the landing. The Delacroix family liked to think of Bellefont as a world complete in itself, prosperous, disciplined, protected by money, law, and routine. At the head of that world was Adrien Delacroix, a planter and parish judge whose name carried weight from courtrooms to warehouses in Baton Rouge. His wife, Emmeline Sauvage Delacroix, came from a merchant family with ties to New Orleans and Plaquemines. Their marriage had joined land to shipping, old parish influence to commercial reach. By 1837, they had two living children, Paul, 9, and Elise, 7. In late April, Emmeline delivered a third child, a son christened Julian. Those first weeks after Julian's birth seemed ordinary enough by the brutal standards of plantation life. The bells rang for the baptism. Gifts arrived from neighboring families. Adrien ordered additional wine brought up from the cellar. The nursery was aired. The silver was polished. The household reset itself around the needs of a new heir. And then, Emmeline began to fail. At first, it was exhaustion, the sort no one found remarkable after childbirth. Then the headaches started. Then the stomach pain. Then the strange pattern that would later make the case impossible to dismiss as fever. She would seem to rally for half a day, only to collapse again with sharper nausea, weakness in the limbs, and a thirst no amount of water relieved. By the second week of June, her skin had lost its color. By the third, she could no longer cross the room without assistance. Dr. Lucien Revel, who had treated the family for years, blamed the season. The low fields bred insects and bad air. Women weakened by childbirth often turned suddenly in the heat. He prescribed tonics, then purgatives, then bleeding. Nothing helped. In fact, each intervention seemed to open the floor beneath her a little further. The more he tried to force her body back toward health, the more violently it seemed to reject him. And always, in the corners of that room, there was Celestine Baptiste. Celestine was not listed in the household in the way the Delacroix family listed themselves. In inventories, she appeared as property, female, approximately 48, Creole, midwife, nurse, herb woman. But on Bellefont, she occupied a stranger and far more dangerous position than the ledgers suggested. She had delivered children on the plantation for more than 2 decades. She knew which babies came early, which mothers hemorrhaged, which old men trembled before they died, which girls hid pregnancies until hiding was no longer possible. She moved between the big house, the cabins, and the infirmary with the quiet authority of someone whom everyone depended on, and no one fully saw. She had delivered Adrien Delacroix himself. She had attended his first wife during a stillbirth years earlier. She had ushered Paul, Elise, and baby Julien into the world. She brewed teas for cramping infants, packed poultices for fever, stitched flesh, soothed mothers, and stood beside beds when the white doctor had already gone home. Bellefont treated her knowledge as useful. It never treated it as power. That was the first mistake. The second was assuming that because Celestine had always served, she had also forgiven. Emmeline died on the night of June 27, 1837, under a mosquito net that barely stirred in the heavy air. The official cause entered into the parish register was postpartum decline complicated by gastric distress, a phrase broad enough to satisfy the priest, the doctor, and the grieving husband, who needed the chaos of the last month to sound ordered on paper. Her funeral was held 2 days later. The church filled with local families in black crepe and summer linen. Adrien stood rigid through the service, his jaw locked so tightly that those nearest to him later said they feared he might shatter a tooth. The children were kept close. Baby Julien remained at the house under the care of his nurse. After the burial, Bellefont entered that peculiar stillness that comes after public grief is performed and private grief begins to rot. The mirrors were veiled. The music stopped. Footsteps seemed louder in the corridors. Even the kitchen fires sounded different, as if the whole house had become aware that something inside it had shifted and was waiting to shift again. It happened sooner than anyone expected. About 3 weeks after Emmeline's burial, Adrien began complaining of a sourness in the stomach and a pounding at the base of the skull. He insisted, at first, that it was lack of sleep, too much brandy, too many legal matters left untouched during his wife's illness. But by the first week of August, he was suffering the same waves of nausea, the same wax and wane collapse, the same dreadful pattern of brief improvement followed by deeper decline. He lost weight rapidly. He grew irritable, then frightened, then too weak to disguise either. Dr. Ravel returned with fresh confidence and old ignorance. He changed the tonics. He adjusted the doses. He blamed lingering household miasma, then overwork, then a digestive inflammation made worse by grief. Yet none of the children were ill. None of the white relatives who had visited during Emmeline's decline had fallen sick. Not one of the people regularly entering and leaving the chamber showed similar symptoms. Whatever had entered that room seemed to know exactly whom it wanted. By mid-August, the household whispers had hardened into two competing explanations. The first was superstition. Some said Emmeline had died unsettled and had carried the room with her. Others said Bellefont had been marked by a judgment no priest could lift. These stories spread because they were easier than the alternative. A haunting required no one in the house to be responsible. The second explanation came from Lisette. Lisette had been bought from a neighboring estate 2 years earlier to attend Emmeline directly. She was young, careful, and clever enough to survive by appearing less observant than she was. During Emmeline's illness, she had noticed that certain cups were set aside for broth, others for tea, others for the diluted wine the doctor recommended. During Adrien's illness, she noticed something else. Celestine preferred to handle the final preparation herself. One evening, as the light died blue over the gallery, Lisette saw Celestine near the sideboard with Adrien's cup and saucer. She was not pouring liquid. She was pinching something between two fingers, a pale gray dust from a cloth packet no larger than a prayer sachet. She tipped it into the cup, stirred once, and tucked the packet back beneath her apron. Lisette said nothing then. Saying the wrong thing about the wrong person on a plantation could ruin a life faster than any poison. Instead, she carried what she had seen to Solomon, the carriage driver, who had known Bellefont longer than she had been alive and believed he understood every danger on the place. At first, Solomon dismissed her. Celestine made remedies. She handled powders. She had done so for years. Everyone knew that, and if she wished the family harm, why wait until now? Why after all this time? Why not strike sooner? Lizette's answer, according to a deposition later taken by the sheriff's clerk, was simple and chilling. Because now she has all of them where she can touch them, she said. The dead wife, the sick master, the baby, is all in the house. That sentence changed as Solomon watched. Over the next 2 days, he positioned himself where he could see the passage between the kitchen and Adrian's room. Twice he saw Celestine prepare the tray alone. Once he saw her add something to a cup. The second time, he saw her do it. She also paused at the nursery table, where baby Julien's feeding bottle stood cooling in a basin of water. Her hand moved quickly. When it withdrew, Solomon could not swear what, if anything, had changed. But he no longer doubted Lisette. He brought the matter to Agnès, the oldest cook on the estate, and one of the very few people whose memory reached back before Adrian's adulthood. Agnès listened without interruption, then closed the pantry door before she answered. There are things about Celestine this house pretends not to remember, she said. Things the walls remember better than the people. What Agnès revealed that night did not yet explain everything, but it gave shape to a motive that had slept inside Bellefont for years. Long before Adrian married Emmeline, before Paul and Elise, before the judge's chair and the polished silver and the airy confidence of the Delacroix name, Celestine had given birth to a daughter. The child's father, according to the story preserved by Agnès, was Adrian's own father, Laurent Delacroix. The little girl was named Odette. She had skin light enough and eyes pale enough to make the truth impossible to hide from those who wished not to see it. When Odette was 4, she was sold. Not to strangers at a distant market, but to relatives of the Sauvage family in Plaquemines, where the transaction could be disguised as a favor, a transfer, a practical household arrangement. On paper, she left Bellefont as property. In reality, she was removed because her face accused the wrong man every time it turned toward the light. Celestine begged to keep her child. She was ignored. Years passed. Odette grew somewhere downriver, in a house tied by blood and business to the very woman Adrian would later marry. Then, according to Agnès, a letter came to Bellefont. She never saw its full contents, but she saw Laurent Delacroix burn it after reading, and heard enough from the fragments that survived in kitchen talk to understand the rest. Odette, then a teenager, had attempted to run. She had been punished. Shortly after, she had died. Whether of fever, beating, confinement, or despair, no one ever learned with certainty. What mattered was that Celestine learned who had possessed her child, and who had buried her. The Delacroix line had taken the girl from her. The Sauvage connection had swallowed the girl whole. And years later those same families joined themselves in marriage under candles, while Celestine stood nearby and watched. Solomon and Lisette spent the rest of that night deciding whether knowledge was enough. They had an answer they had not wanted. Julien's bottle had to be stopped before Adrian's tray reached the room. When Celestine stepped away to fetch linens, Lisette lifted the bottle, uncorked it, and poured the milk into the ash pit behind the kitchen. Solomon took Adrian's cup and emptied it beside the same wall. Fresh portions were prepared in their place. Neither spoke while doing it. If they were wrong, they had tampered with a sick man's treatment and a baby's food. If they were right, They were standing in the narrow space between a family and extinction. That evening, Dr. Ravel noticed something unsettling. Adrian, who had worsened steadily for days, did not improve exactly, but neither did he sink. His pulse steadied. He held down broth. The agony in his stomach did not vanish, yet it arrived less violently. It was the first interruption in the pattern. The next day, Solomon and Lizette searched Celestine's cabin. Hidden beneath a loose hearthstone, they found the material shape of the household's dread. Stitched cloth packets filled with powder, dried leaves bound with thread, a stoppered blue bottle, and a folded stack of pages written in French, Creole, and phonetic fragments the clerk later struggled to transcribe. The pages did not read like a confession. They read like a ledger of effects. Cramping after tea, vomiting after broth, skin color after 2 days, weakness in the legs, improvement when dosage withheld. There were also older items tucked farther back beneath the stone. A tiny coral bracelet, a child's saint medal rubbed nearly smooth, and a lock of dark curling hair tied with faded yellow ribbon. The bracelet, Agnes said when she saw it, had belonged to Odette. Dr. Ravel was summoned privately before the sheriff. He tested the powders as best a provincial physician could, and identified arsenical compounds among them, mixed with crushed plant matter from ornamental shrubs and wild growth found near drainage ditches and fence lines. It was enough for him. Enough for Solomon. Enough for Adrian's brother, who arrived in a panic and ordered the parish authorities sent for at once. Celestine was arrested on August 19th, without struggle. Witnesses later remembered her expression with unnerving consistency. She did not protest. She did not plead. She did not feign confusion. She simply removed her apron, folded it once, and placed it on the chair near the cabin door, as though she had finished one kind of work and was prepared to begin another. The proceedings that followed drew planters, merchants, priests, and rumor-hungry onlookers from across the river parishes. There was no mystery left about who stood accused. The question that electrified the district was how long she had planned it, and whether she meant only to kill or to erase. Because that possibility, once spoken aloud, changed the case from household murder to something larger and more terrible. Emmeline was dead. Adrian had nearly followed her. Julian's bottle had been touched. If the infant had died as well, the Delacroix line through Emmeline Sauvage would have been gutted in a single season. The revenge would not have stopped at grief. It would have entered inheritance, property, name, and memory. Celestine was not given the kind of defense white defendants expected as a matter of course. The machinery of law moved around her, not for her. Dr. Ravel testified about symptoms, timing, and the powders recovered. Solomon and Lizette described what they had seen. Adrian, still weakened and yellowed from the illness, appeared long enough to be carried into the chamber and identify the woman who had served his house for years. Then Agnes spoke. Her testimony stripped the scandal of any comforting simplicity. This was no random malice, no sudden madness, no folk superstition metastasized into crime. It was a grievance aged in silence under compulsion. A mother whose child had been taken. A woman required to save lives in the same family that had shattered her own. A healer whose skill made her indispensable, but never safe. Agnes did not excuse what had happened. She did something more dangerous. She explained it. That explanation disturbed the court more than the poison. A monster could be condemned cleanly. A human being produced by the logic of slavery could not. When the presiding magistrate finally asked whether Celestine wished to say anything before sentence, the room reportedly went silent enough to hear movement in the gallery outside. The version preserved in the clerk's record varies slightly across copies, but the meaning remains the same. "I carried their children," she said. "I washed their blood from the sheets. I kept breath in that house when God had nearly taken it. They took my child and sent me back to work. They ate, they slept, they married, they named sons. They asked these hands to bless all of it. I did not put death in that house. It was there already. I only taught it where to sit." No one who heard those words forgot them. Sentence came swiftly. On September 3, 1837, Celestine Baptiste was hanged behind the parish jail before a crowd large enough that merchants sold food from carts outside the square. Newspaper language from the time emphasized order restored, justice performed, household safety redeemed. Yet even some of those accounts betrayed unease. They described her composure. They described the silence that fell when the trap opened. They described, without understanding why it mattered, that many in the crowd would not meet her eyes beforehand. Adrien Delacroix recovered, but not completely. For the rest of his life, he was said to eat lightly, drink cautiously, and distrust anything he had not watched being poured. He never remarried. Paul and Elise were sent for periods to relatives in New Orleans. Julien survived infancy, though family letters decades later suggest he grew up in the shadow of a story no one could tell plainly without implicating the dead. Bellefont itself did not outlast the century. The estate staggered through price shocks, flood years, war, and emancipation. By the 1870s, sections of the land had been sold off. The main house suffered a fire in one wing and was rebuilt badly, then abandoned outright after another flood undermined the rear foundation. Local people salvaged bricks, hinges, and cypress boards. The cane fields changed hands. The road shifted. The place that had once projected permanence began to sink back into weather and undergrowth. But the story did not disappear with the house. It surfaced whenever another poisoning rumor moved through Louisiana. It surfaced in legal discussions about restricting enslaved and later freed black healers from keeping certain compounds or practicing without white supervision. It surfaced in family papers, where descendants wrote around the event instead of naming it. And it surfaced most stubbornly in parish folklore, where Celestine ceased to be a defendant and became something more difficult, a figure through whom people argued about justice they had never truly wanted to define. In 1911, when laborers clearing old foundation stones near the former Bellefont site uncovered a small ceramic jar sealed with wax, they expected coins or religious objects. Instead, they found a coral child's bracelet, a saint medal, 2 rusted hairpins, and a scrap of cloth so deteriorated it disintegrated at the first touch. The local paper treated the discovery as a curiosity. An antiquarian in Baton Rouge suggested the jar had been hidden as a keepsake cache. No official record connected it to Celestine or Odette. No official record needed to. By then, the parish already knew what objects women kept when the law recognized none of their losses. Later oral histories taken in the 1930s preserved another detail that never made it into the court file. According to 2 elderly interviewees whose grandparents had lived on or near Bellefont, the people quartered behind the main house used to say the worst danger was not Celestine's anger, but her patience. She did not strike in panic. She waited until the family had drawn her so close to their most intimate rituals that the boundary between care and destruction could disappear inside a teacup, a tonic, a nursery bottle, a hand laid cool against a fevered forehead. That is what makes the case linger. It is not only the death of Emmeline Delacroix, or the near death of Adrian, or the terrifying possibility that an infant heir might have been next. It is the method by which vengeance moved. Not through open rebellion, not through public accusation, through service, through touch, through the daily acts by which one human being is trusted near the weakness of another. In a society built on forced dependency, that kind of access was more frightening than a knife. And the moral comfort the story refuses us is precisely why it survived. If you turn Celestine into a folk witch, the plantation world gets to remain innocent. If you turn her into a monster, the legal system that killed her gets to look righteous. If you call the Delacroix family simply cursed, then history dissolves into atmosphere, and no one has to admit what structures made the revenge possible in the first place. But the record, fractured as it is, points somewhere harder. Celestine's knowledge was cultivated because the plantation needed it. Her obedience was assumed because the plantation demanded it. Her child was taken because the plantation could do that. Her grief was ignored because the plantation had no category in which her motherhood counted. And when that same world later found poison moving through its own bedrooms and nurseries, it called the result evil without acknowledging the system that had taught her, day after day, exactly where the house was most vulnerable. None of that absolves the dead. None of it revives them either. Emmeline was 28 years old when she died. Odette was likely younger when she did. Between those two losses lies the real horror of the story. A world so saturated with theft that tenderness itself became usable as a weapon. Even now, in West Feliciana, old people sometimes speak about the former Bellefont tract in practical voices that suddenly go quiet. They mention failed building plans, tools misplaced, work crews refusing to stay late. They mention the smell of something bitter when the heat presses down before rain. They mention, more rarely, that there are places where history does not feel buried so much as waiting under the next loose stone. Perhaps that is only folklore. Perhaps folklore is what remains when official archives cannot bear the full moral weight of what they contain. Either way, the Delacroix case leaves behind the same question it posed the moment Celestine spoke in court. What does justice become in a world where law protects the theft that started the wound? For the Delacroix family, the answer arrived slowly, inside cups and bottles carried by familiar hands. For Celestine, it arrived on a scaffold built by the same order that had destroyed her child. For the parish that watched both unfold, it arrived as a story too revealing to forget, and too compromising to remember honestly. And that may be the final reason the case endured. Beneath the gossip, beneath the courtroom spectacle, beneath the ghost stories and the later archaeological curiosities, the story of Bellefont says something the Plantation South never wanted spoken aloud. When a system makes human intimacy part of its machinery, it also creates the conditions for revenge to travel through that intimacy with terrifying precision. Long after the house fell, long after the cane rows were broken up and replanted under other names, that truth remained. Not as a curse, as a ledger. One entry for what was taken, one entry for what was returned, and no clean balance anywhere on the page.